Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosatris, and this week we're talking about Moby-Dick. Now, this book was written in 1851, and when it was released, it got kind of a frosty reception. People didn't really get it, they didn't really like it, it was kind of considered strange, and it sort of fell out of favor. In fact, by the time Herman Melville died in 1891, the book was out of print. And it wasn't until the early 20th century, on the anniversary of Herman Melville's 100th birthday, that this book really got sort of reevaluated and became sort of the great American novel. Since then, it's never been out of print, and it's kind of risen up the canon of kind of the great works to be considered something kind of truly special. But the question is it really good? Or was it just a matter of it appealed to those kind of early 20th century modernists because it was weird? And so I wanted to revisit this. I've read this book twice and I really loved it. It's a big favorite of mine, but I feel like it's developed a reputation that it doesn't really deserve. It's kind of seen as stuffy and boring and just kind of bland and repetitive, and it talks too much about like facts and figures and stuff, and it just isn't really engaging. So I wanted to revisit Moby-Dick and give it its due justice, because this book is genuinely really excellent and it deserves to be kind of looked at in a new light. Now, this book here, it blends different narrative types together, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but it blends different narrative types together in order to tell the story. So it's not just like a revenge story. It's not just a book about boats. It feels big and grand in a way that something like Hamlet does. You know, if you look at Hamlet, and you don't really just see it as just like, oh, it's just a story of like court drama, you know. It's not like, you know, The Great on the CW kind of thing. It's more than that. It's not just drama. It's telling a huge, vast story about like death and the afterlife and human nature and insanity and even gender roles and just all of that. Like, Hamlet feels big and sweeping, and so does this. This book really appealed to writers like William Faulkner and D.H. Lawrence in the early 20th century. They both really loved it, and you can kind of see what they were going for, because at that time modernism was in America, and it was kind of taking things in new directions. It was changing the way novels were written. And this book kind of feels like it was written kind of ahead of its time, because it blends these different narrative styles together. And so it takes risks in a way that a modernist novel would, but it's not a modernist novel. And so it's kind of like it was sort of out of touch with what was happening. But this book really has a sense of grandeur to it that I think adds a lot to it. The beginning section, it's just a list of like minutia. It seems like something you can skip when you read it, but if you're going to read it, I say read through this beginning section, because it really gives the book its sense of heft and scale. First, you've got a section called etymology, and it's got like just the word whale in different languages, and it shows how the word, like kind of how we got the word whale and how it changed over time and how different languages borrowed the word and changed it and everything. And then there's another section called extracts, which is just quotes from poems, plays, books, songs that mention whales. And in so doing, it's almost like it's saying, you know, this is the literary canon, and this is where we fit in this. This is where this book fits in this, because it's telling a huge story. And so it's not just about a whale. It's not just about a ship. It's about sort of the capital W whale and all the romance and drama and kind of mythology that feels connected to that. And so you really get a sense that this isn't just a story about a boat meeting a whale. This is a story about something much bigger and more cosmic, and it gets to feel like mythology at this point. It's more like it's talking about dragons or the Kraken or the Hydra, and it's not just talking about like normal animals that live in the world. It sort of elevates them to kind of a vast, sweeping level. So we'll get into this, and hopefully you get something out of it. So getting into the book, one thing you're going to notice is that it's not all written like a novel. There are sections where we get like completely different genres. There's some sections that are written like a play, like a stage play script with like stage directions and lines and stuff. There's 3 sections that are like Shakespearean soliloquies, written or like spoken in the voice of the person doing that. So we get inside the heads of 3 different characters. There's other sections that feel more like comedic slapstick, especially early on. There's stuff with Ishmael, especially Ishmael and Queequeg, that feel kind of more like a comedic kind of farce sort of story. And then there's others that feel a little more detached. The narrator feels more like an omniscient narrator, like a more traditional omniscient narrator, and it's a little more like informative, kind of, you know, giving a day in the life kind of thing, more historical voice, as if this was kind of a real thing that happened, and the voice is saying, you know, this is what it's like a biography kind of thing, that sort of drier narrative voice. But the combination of all these different things create this sense of, this isn't just a story, this is a world where the sailors are all kind of in perpetual conflict with these sort of vast mythological creatures. And so it feels a little bit less like it's just, oh, this is just the day in the life, and it's more like this is sort of an epic struggle. And at the heart of that struggle is sort of like capitalism itself, because they're all doing this because whale oil is so important to lamps back home, and it's such a vital part of the economy, and it makes the people who are in charge of this so much money. And the ships itself, they were kind of, everyone would sort of buy into it. It was sort of like an investment. Everyone would buy into the voyage, and then depending on how well they did, that's how much money they would make. And so everyone's caught up in this sort of money-making machine that is both kind of grinding them down, but it's also doing the same thing literally to the whales that they're up against. But the sailors themselves, especially the harpooners, they really respect the whales. It's not like they're just a resource to be gathered. Some definitely see it that way, but others, they see it as sort of this ongoing battle that they're involved in. And I think that gives this book a really huge scope that I think is really engaging and fun. Now, focusing on Ahab himself, Ahab is a really important character, but I think when he first shows up, he's just kind of a normal captain. Like, you know, he's imposing for sure, and he's mysterious, but he just feels like just the captain, and, you know, Ishmael's like, oh, this is going to be a weird voyage, you know, kind of thing. But as the story goes, Ahab kind of becomes like this mythological hero, someone you'd see in like a Greek tragedy or a Shakespeare play, complete with like the prophecy about his life that kind of tells how he's going to end up. And it's like he's fighting against cosmic odds as he's trying to take revenge on this whale that crippled him. But at the same time, he's the one who kind of engineers his own destruction. So it's difficult to say whether this is, we're supposed to look up to Ahab because he doesn't let go of his debts. You know, he believes in honor. Or you look at him a little more realistically, and he's kind of a foolhardy captain who gets everyone on his ship killed, for the most part. Sorry for the spoiler, but everyone knows that. Who gets everyone on his ship killed because he's so obsessive, and it's that fatal flaw that kind of undoes everything. And so in a way, there's almost the feeling of like the Odyssey in all this, or the Iliad. You've got, you know, Achilles who's doomed to die, a hero, or to live out a comfortable life as a nobody. And this kind of takes that archetype, but over the course of the story, he becomes this mythological figure, so that when um, Ishmael is kind of left alive at the end, it's almost like Ishmael is sort of the chronicler of this epic, and so he has the power then to turn Ahab into kind of a mythological figure and tell his story of what happened. So I don't know. I'm probably overselling it a little bit, but the book really feels big and sweeping in a way that it's really hard to see in other novels. I'm going to bring up something like Middlemarch by George Eliot, and it's more realistic, and it tells a big story. There's a huge cast of characters. Everyone has really big character arcs, but it doesn't feel mythological in the same way that this one does. That book is longer even. Middlemarch tells a very grand story, but it's a very grand, realistic story, grounded in kind of the history of the time period that it's set in. And so this one doesn't feel like that. This one feels like it starts out in a historical period, but then it kind of, once they get out to sea, it's like they move outside of the bubble of history, and they become sort of the realm of monsters, and the rules kind of shift a little bit. The stakes get bigger and the personalities get bigger. And so I think that's one reason why I really like this one. Now, with that all said, I don't want you to think that this is a dry, serious book, because there are moments of levity, particularly with Ishmael. And this gets into something else that I wanted to talk about, and that is the homoerotic subtext of the book. There is a lot of it. Early on, there's a scene between Ishmael and Queequeg that really fits into the kind of there's only one bed trope. And it's played for laughs, but it ends with kind of Ishmael saying like, and that was the best sleep of my entire life kind of thing. And it's just, there's lots of moments like that. Now, it's very subtle, and you can ignore it if you want to. It's not kind of an essential part of it. But if you go looking for it, it's there. Like, it's very clear. This is a very homoerotic book in the way that like the Iliad is. It's a very homosocial environment. You've got there's no female characters whatsoever. And you got all these guys on the boat, and the way they describe one another, especially if they're kind of heroic or muscular or big or something, the descriptions are very kind of admiring. And that kind of brings up the question of Herman Melville himself. Now, I'm not going to speculate, because we honestly don't know, but Herman Melville was very much probably on that spectrum of sexuality somewhere, because there's a lot in here there's a lot in his life that just kind of leans it to that. The first thing I'm going to say is this is a reproduction of the dedication. Now, Nathaniel Hawthorne was someone that he really admired. And if you read his letters to Hawthorne, they get very, not clingy, but just a little over the top. Now, we do know that in that day and age, men were able to be more kind of openly affectionate with their male friends. And we know that Hawthorne didn't reciprocate all this. He kind of, he saw him as a colleague, a fellow writer. He admired his work, but it wasn't anything like that. But Melville's interest in Hawthorne was very much more than one would expect. Now, it may just be that Melville was just a very dramatic person, and so he kind of went a little overboard in his letters, but scholars have described his letters to Hawthorne as being like sexually charged in many ways. So there's definitely an admiration there that either speaks to something latent or whatever. So, we know for sure that he had a big man crush on Hawthorne. What we don't know is if it was like a real crush. Because in that day and age, it's really difficult to say. There's not a lot that was allowed, and so it was very much kind of hidden, and so people were not very open about this kind of thing. And even if they were, they would still very often get married, and they would have kids. And so, if there was anything there, it's probably been lost to history. But a lot of people suspect that, you know, Melville definitely did swing that way at least a little bit, which it makes reading this, I think, a whole lot more fun, because when you're on the lookout for that kind of subtext, you just see such joy and freedom and delight in it, because he's describing a situation where there is no expectations of like marriage or societal rules and stuff. It's just everyone's on the ship and they can just be themselves. And so there's kind of a freedom in that I think he really appreciated. And so if you look at that kind of aspect of this, it adds so much to it, and it actually makes it a lot more fun and a lot more relatable. You can kind of, it grounds it a little bit more, so it's not just this kind of sweeping, you know, full of archetypes kind of thing. You know, Ishmael is just a guy, but it's very clear that he doesn't fit in with his world when he's on land. At the beginning, he describes it as kind of this depression he gets when he's on land for too long, and he starts kind of hanging around funeral processions, and he starts annoying people, knocking their hats off, and just kind of becomes restless and sad. But then when he's on the boat, he becomes kind of his complete self, where he's like, finally, I feel safe. I feel like I have a purpose again. And it's really great to kind of see that change in Ishmael. Now, Ishmael he's the main character for part of the book. We meet him at the beginning, of course, you know, the first line, call me Ishmael. So we're not even sure if that's his real name. He just says, call me Ishmael. So it's like, okay. And we follow him, but once he gets on the boat, the narrator kind of shifts a bit. Again, we get like the omniscient narrator. We also get like the play sections. We get the soliloquy sections where we're inside different characters' heads. And then, so it kind of begins and ends with Ishmael, and he is part of it, and you can pick out the chapters that are kind of in his voice, because they're very different from kind of the other ones. But Ishmael is kind of the one, he's the fun guy that we sort of follow, and him and Queequeg, their friendship is really good. Now, I will say there are unfortunate racial stereotypes in this. They're not, I'm not going to say they're not as bad, but like, it's clear that Melville respected these people, but there was so much cultural baked in racism, like systemic racism, that no matter how much Melville and Ishmael talk about how much they respect these people who are from other countries and other islands and such, there are still some stereotypical things that come in through the text. So be aware of that. It hasn't aged well, but you can tell there wasn't kind of malicious intent behind it. And lastly, I want to talk about the length of the book, because there's this sense that it's this massive, huge, like enormous book, and it really isn't. So this is the Norton Critical Edition. This is the text of the book here. That's that. Now these are thin pages, but the audiobook is like 24 hours long, which is a lot less than most everything else. So it's about the same length as like it's about the same length as like the Fellowship of the Ring, if you're, you know, and that book isn't really considered a massive, overwhelming tome. So it's not as long as you think it is. So don't get scared of it. And the chapters are usually really short. If you want to read like one chapter a day, you can get through it in time. But they're short enough chapters that you can get through it. So don't be intimidated by it. This book is fun. This book is wonderful. This book is very cool. And there's lots that you can kind of make fun of the book, because it's basically like Herman Melville. He gets excited at times and kind of goes into like hyperfixation mode. And so when he's talking really passionately about how a ship is built or how you cut the head of a whale off, he does it with such enthusiasm that you just can't help but be charmed by it. So you know, don't see this as something stuffy and bland and everything. This is, if you go into it with the right mindset, go into it wanting to enjoy it, there's a lot to love in this one. For the same reason that, you know, when Dracula Daily went through and everyone kind of revisited this book, and they really found a lot to love in the characters, and certain characters who have kind of been forgotten became like fan favorites. We definitely need something similar with this, because this is a great reading experience. It's weird and it's fun, and if you unhook your brain a little bit and just read it as though you're reading like the Odyssey instead of reading something a lot more realistic, I think you'll have a lot more fun. So that's what I'm going to leave it as. Now, I will say, if you have read this, I'd love to hear what you thought of it. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Were you forced to read it for school? Was it a traumatizing experience? What was kind of your experience with that? So let me know in the comments. Also, thank you everyone who has liked and subscribed to videos. I'm kind of a small channel and I'm okay with that, but it's always wonderful whenever I get comments from people asking questions and all that stuff. So I really appreciate the feedback and the ability to kind of connect with people who share all of my weird niche interests. So with that said, I will let you go. I'll see you next week, and happy reading. Bye.